With the upcoming, seemingly disastrous Windows 11 release, you might find that your computer is actually too old to make the switch. In fact, I myself can't make the switch to Windows 11, despite the fact that my computer is not actually that old. Of course, you can stay on Windows 10 for quite some time until 2025, but what about after that? Do you switch to Windows 11 and upgrade to new hardware? Is there any alternative to Windows? There is, and it's called Linux. You've probably heard of Linux before, and you also probably heard how Linux is terrible for gaming. However, this has changed a lot, even in the past 3 or 4 years. This is thanks to a new compatibility layer called Proton, created by Valve and integrated directly into Steam. Now, when I say new, it's not actually new. It's a fork of a software called Wine, which is a Windows compatibility layer created for Linux. The thing about Linux compared to Windows is because Linux users are only 1% of the Steam user base, most games do not get natively made for Linux. If they do get natively made, chances are the port won't be very good. Creating a separate version of a game for another OS is similar to creating a separate version for another console. Calls that make sense on Windows don't make sense on Linux, hence why we need some form of a compatibility layer in order to run Windows programs on Linux. Now, launching games on Linux is as simple as going into the Steam settings, turning on the Steam Play for all games, and then hitting play. Of course, not every game works immediately out of the box, but if you go onto ProtonDB, you'll find that quite a few games run nearly perfectly on Linux. Now, you might question why I would switch to Linux over Windows when I might lose some performance because of the compatibility layer, and I also have to learn an entirely new operating system which can be complicated. Well, for one, learning Linux might not be as hard as you think. A Linux distribution like Ubuntu, for example, which is actually the one I'm using while writing this now, operates very similarly to Windows and doesn't take very long to get used to. And if you do find Ubuntu to be too foreign, there are Linux distros out there like Linux Mint, which is based off of Ubuntu, that are specifically meant to feel similar to Windows. So the question is, what does Linux do that Windows doesn't? What does Linux do better that Windows does worse? One major thing I appreciate about Linux that Windows is really bad at is that Linux is a very unintrusive operating system. What do I mean when I say unintrusive? Well, have you ever been playing a game on Windows and suddenly you get Alt-Tab so that Windows can tell you you need an update? Have you ever been Alt-Tab because Windows decides that it needs to tell you that your space is low now? Do you run a server, or a bot, or something similar that requires your computer to be on 24/7? Has Windows ever randomly done an update, restarted, and interrupted said server or bot? Maybe you restart your computer to refresh things, and without your knowing, Windows installed an update in the past and decided that now it was going to install the rest. You can disable Windows updates manually through different workarounds, but this isn't a really great idea. Windows releases those patches for reasons, and you do eventually want to pick those up. And personally, I don't like having to do manual updates to make sure I'm not behind on security patches. Linux, however, takes a completely different approach on how it handles patches. Linux may automatically install updates, but even if it does, it won't intrusively Alt-Tab you to tell you, hey, I've updated your system, sorry that I just killed you during Battlefront 2, but this update is really important. It doesn't actually do anything, but trust me, it's really important. Linux will tell you that you're running out of space because you have too much garbage, but it won't stop you from your intense Minecraft diamond mining. In my opinion, a good operating system is very similar to good music in a movie. Most of the time it'll go unnoticed, and if it is noticed, it's probably because it's bad. The only time I remember I'm running on Windows is when I get Alt-Tab for low space, killing me in-game, or when my computer shuts down randomly to install updates. Really, if you're constantly thinking about your operating system, chances are it's because there's a problem. The next thing Linux does better than Windows is package management. Linux is really good at managing apps on your computer and easily updating them all at once. And no, you don't necessarily have to go into the command line for this. On Ubuntu, which if you're new to Linux is in my opinion the best distro to go to, there's an app store similar to Mac and an updater that has a GUI. So if you're trying to update your system, you can do it through that. When you're talking about package management on Linux, you have to talk about repositories. A repository's literal definition in terms of computers is a central location in which data is stored and managed. This is a pretty solid explanation for repositories in Linux. Let me give an example. Say Chrome releases a new update. Google will then push that update to the Google Chrome repository. When your computer checks for updates, it searches the repositories you've added to the computer. If it finds an update, it will eventually prompt you to install that update. The benefit of repositories and package managers is that if everything you've downloaded has a repository, when Linux checks for updates, it can check for updates for every program and update everything at once. Theoretically, the GUI updater should work just fine, but you can also check for updates with just 2 lines in a command prompt. Typing in sudo apt update and then sudo apt upgrade, assuming you're on Ubuntu, will check for and then install any updates to any programs with repositories, and this includes the actual OS itself. So, the first half of this script was written about 2 months ago, maybe 3 now, and since I have stopped using Linux and have left my Linux honeymoon period. The first half of this video was basically talking up Linux in every regard, making it sound better than Windows in every way. However, since using Linux on both my laptop and desktop for probably about a month all put together, I wanted to explain why I stopped using it. So the next part will be about the shortcomings of Linux. So let's start with Proton. I'll give Valve full credit here and say Proton is kind of amazing. Before this month-long daily drive on Ubuntu, a while back, probably in 2014 or 2015, I tried Linux Mint. Back then it was not as simple as flicking Proton on and pressing play. Every game had to be painstakingly made to run on Wine. But that's not to say Proton is perfect, far from it. For one, Proton only covers Steam games. If you've got games on the EGS, Microsoft's excuse for a store, Uconnect, Origin, or anything else not on Steam, you're out of luck. And even with Proton, there are plenty of edge cases. For example, Star Wars Empire at War. The base game runs fine with a few crashes here and there, but that's probably because it's from 2006, not because it's on Proton. Anyway, the only real reason anyone plays the game anymore is because of mods. And this is where the edge case comes into play. The vanilla game is fine, but modded is extremely sluggish. Doing anything like trying to drop in new units made the FPS tank hard, and just in general, the FPS was lower than on Windows. Besides this, I'm sure there are loads of less popular and/or older titles on Steam that don't work with Proton. Will they ever get fixed? Maybe, but probably not. And even popular titles that do work with Proton might only work after a couple of simple but annoying tweaks. Final Fantasy XIV is a great example of this. If I remember correctly, when you first launch Final Fantasy XIV, the thing you'll get first is a broken launcher. From there, you need to close the launcher, go to some settings text file, and change it to the old launcher. Then launch the old launcher and click play, except don't, because if you click play, it'll crash the launcher. Instead, type in your credentials and hit enter. And black screen. Now, since the game is almost fully launched, it created another settings file that you now need to go edit to turn off the opening cinematic, and then you can play as normal. After all of these tweaks, the game runs like native. The story here is really one of death by paper cuts. It's not the performance of Final Fantasy XIV that's the problem, it's how annoying it is to get it to work. Most games are like this, they'll work just fine, but only after some tweaks. Guilty Gear Strive works, but only if you turn the settings to max or else you get a blurry mess. Battlefront 2017 works, but only if you download Lutris to install Origin correctly. Tales of Arise works, but good luck getting rid of the screen tearing, etc., etc. If effort is put in, mostly anything can work just fine, but it's the effort put in that's the problem. Imagine being the average Joe working from 8 to 5. When I come home from my job and hop on my PC to play Halo Infinite with the boys, I don't want to feel like I need my own real-life version of Cortana to get it to work. I just want to come home, hit play, and start shooting dudes. To finally end off this stupidly long video, I want to talk about 2 more things. Xorg and VR gaming on Linux. One of which arguably doesn't exist, so let's start with that one. VR gaming on Linux can be accurately described with this image courtesy of Steam VR. Honestly, I have no idea why there were this many errors when I first started up VR, but this kind of sums up my experience. Comedians may as well give up, because the biggest joke has already been released and it's called Steam VR on Linux. In the time of saying that sentence, someone, somewhere, has had their Linux instance of Steam VR crash several times. And to that person I would say, yes, we are here just to suffer. The games themselves seem to work, but SteamVR does not. Besides this, SteamVR feels significantly jittery on Linux. I remember switching back to Windows VR after trying Linux VR for a while, and it was like the VR version of going from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. There's not really much else to say about VR on Linux besides the fact that it just does not work. So let's finally get around to ending this video and talk about what actually made me stop using Linux entirely: Xorg. You've either felt the touch of a woman, or you know what Xorg is. Xorg, no, not Corgi, Google spell check, is the display server for Linux. What does that mean? It's what handles how things are displayed graphically, or something like that. All you need to know about Xorg is that it's old and outdated. I use a 144Hz monitor for my main, and a 60Hz for my secondary. Because Xorg sucks, it only supports one refresh rate, meaning I can either have two monitors at 144, or two at 60, but not one at 144 and one at 60. This means that I can either get another 144Hz monitor, use only my main monitor, or use both and have it cap at 60Hz. 144Hz is a big deal. The higher the hertz, the smoother the feel of the gameplay, provided you have the frame rate that matches the refresh rate. Also, a limitation of Xorg is that G-Sync only works on one display. For me to have G-Sync, I'd have to unplug my second display. I like to watch Netflix, Twitch, or YouTube while I game, so this was an absolute deal breaker for me. Buying a second 144Hz monitor is too expensive, and having to unplug my second monitor every time I wanted to game would be a massive pain. And honestly, how the hell does anyone refer to Xorg as anything but complete garbage? How can a display server in 2021 not have support for multi-monitor G-Sync and different refresh rates? On top of this, moving back to Windows, I noticed that the entire experience, even on desktop, just felt smoother. Even on my laptop, which has a single 144Hz display. So here's the thing. There's a new display server called Wayland. But here's the problem. NVIDIA, like Xorg, also sucks, and here's why. AMD has made their drivers open source, and as a result, the Linux community has been able to adapt the drivers to play nice with Wayland. As of this paper, most AMD users will probably have no issues running on Wayland. And here's where NVIDIA sucks. Unlike AMD, NVIDIA has kept their drivers closed source, and been extremely slow to add Wayland support. Before I stopped using Linux, I tried Wayland on both of my machines, both NVIDIA powered. The results were not good. NVIDIA Optimus laptops, which is the name for a laptop that has both onboard and dedicated graphics and switches to and from them, depending on whether it's plugged in or not, crashes immediately when plugging in a monitor to the laptop. My desktop, while it did work, was super laggy. I noticed an extreme drop in frame rate trying to load a game on Wayland, and horrible screen tearing. Ironically, what made me switch off of Linux technically had nothing to do with gaming on Linux itself, and instead was a result of NVIDIA being anti-consumer. So thanks NVIDIA, you win the #1 award for the worst company to start with the letter N that isn't Nestle. In conclusion, what do I think about gaming on Linux? It's getting there. In just a few years, Valve has done some incredible work with Proton, and it's so much better than it used to be. But it's still not as user-friendly and reliable as it needs to be. I mean, just go watch LTT. And for the love of God, Valve, please fix SteamVR. Anyway, that's the end of my introspective on Linux. Yes, I did have to look up introspective on Google, and no, I'm still not sure I used it right. Thanks for watching. Peace.